My name is Frank Dietrich. I'm 54 years old. I live just outside Dayton, Ohio, in the same house I bought 20 years ago, with a workshop in the detached garage where I still tinker on weekends, even though I have a full machine shop 4 miles away that does the actual production work. My wife Carol teaches middle school math. My son Tommy is finishing his second year studying mechanical engineering at Ohio State, which still makes me a little dizzy with pride every time I think about it, because I never went to college myself and never needed to for the work I do. I'm a machinist. I started as an apprentice at 19 at a tool and die shop that no longer exists, and I have spent the 35 years since then learning, in increasingly precise increments, how to cut and shape metal to tolerances that most people cannot meaningfully picture. When I tell someone I work to a tolerance of 2/10,000ths of an inch, the number doesn't really land until I explain that a human hair is roughly 3/1000ths of an inch thick. The parts I make are not allowed to be off by more than a fraction of that. There is no room for approximation in my work. Either the part is correct or it fails. And in the industries I work in, aerospace components mostly, failure is not an abstraction. It is something that can come apart at 30,000 feet. I opened Dietrich Precision Components 14 years ago, with a second mortgage on the house and a used CNC machine I bought from a shop that was liquidating. 6 employees now. We do specialized contract machining for several clients, but the largest and most important of those relationships, for the past 6 years, has been with Halverson Dynamics, a mid-sized aerospace component supplier based about 40 minutes from my shop. The relationship between my shop and Halverson is built on something specific. 11 years ago, while still working as a senior machinist at a larger firm, I designed and patented a particular valve assembly mechanism, a pressure-regulating component used in a class of hydraulic actuator systems. I won't pretend the invention came from nowhere. It came from years of watching a recurring failure mode in similar assemblies and gradually working out, on my own time, a geometry that solved it. I filed the patent myself, paid for it myself, and held it personally rather than assigning it to my employer at the time, which was, at the time, a contentious decision that nearly cost me that job. It turned out to be the most important decision of my professional life. When I opened my own shop several years later, I approached Halverson Dynamics with a licensing proposal. I would manufacture the patented valve assembly exclusively for their use in a particular product line, under a contract that combined a manufacturing agreement with a patent licensing fee. They needed the part. The part worked. The agreement made sense for both sides, and we signed it 6 years ago. Since then, my shop has produced this specific component in batches on a recurring schedule, and Halverson has built an entire downstream product line around the assumption that this component will continue to be available on schedule at the specification it has always met. I tell you all of this not to boast, but because it matters enormously to what happened next. The trouble started, as these things often do, with a cost-cutting initiative. Halverson Dynamics had brought on a new board member roughly 8 months earlier, a woman named Vanessa Cole, who had built her reputation at a much larger industrial conglomerate doing what is sometimes called operational efficiency consulting, which, in practice, often means identifying vendor relationships and contracts to renegotiate or eliminate. She was, by every account I later heard, smart, aggressive, and entirely unfamiliar with the specific engineering history of the products her new company manufactured. I learned what happened in that boardroom secondhand from Halverson's director of procurement, a man named Russ Calloway, who had worked with my shop since the relationship began, and who called me the same evening, sounding like a man who had just watched something happen that he couldn't quite stop. According to Russ, the quarterly vendor review had reached the line item for my shop's contract, a sum that, viewed purely as a number on a spreadsheet, looked larger than comparable line items for other machining vendors Halverson used. Vanessa Cole had flagged it. "What is this?" she'd asked, according to Russ. "And why are we paying a small machine shop in Ohio more than we pay our Tier 1 suppliers for components a third this size?" Russ had tried to explain. The component in question wasn't a generic part. It was patented technology, licensed exclusively, manufactured by the patent holder himself, and the pricing reflected both the manufacturing cost and the licensing fee built into the original agreement. According to Russ, Vanessa had waived this off. "Then we renegotiate the license. Or we find an alternative supplier who can make an equivalent part without the markup. I don't care whose name is on a patent from a decade ago. This is a vendor relationship, and vendor relationships get renegotiated when the math doesn't make sense. Russ told her, carefully, because he said her tone made clear that pushback was not particularly welcome, that there was no equivalent part. The patent covered the specific mechanism that solved the failure mode. Other suppliers could make a valve assembly, but not this valve assembly. Not without infringing on intellectual property that I personally owned and had never licensed to anyone but Halverson. This is the part of the story that Russ told me with a particular note of disbelief in his voice. Vanessa had looked at the contract summary in front of her, not the contract itself, just a summary document prepared by someone else, and said, in front of the full executive team and 2 other board members, I find it hard to believe our entire product line is held hostage by a single machinist who got lucky with a patent filing a decade ago. I want this relationship terminated within the quarter, and an alternative sourcing plan on my desk in 3 weeks. Russ said the room went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when someone senior has said something that several people in the room know is a serious mistake, but nobody senior enough to correct it wants to be the one to do it. He called me that night, partly to warn me, and partly, I think, because he needed to say it out loud to someone who would understand exactly how large a mistake had just been made. I want to be honest about how I felt hearing this. I was not panicked. I have built a business slowly and deliberately enough that a single client relationship, even an unimportant one, does not represent existential risk to my company. I have other contracts. I have savings. I was not afraid for Dietrich Precision Components. What I felt was something closer to a very specific, very calm form of clarity, the kind you get when you watch someone confidently begin a process that you know, with complete certainty, cannot end the way they expect it to. What did the actual contract language say? I asked Russ. Specifically, the licensing section. You wrote it, Russ said. You tell me. I had, in fact, written most of it myself, with a patent attorney's help. 11 years of professional caution distilled into careful clauses. The contract specified that Dietrich Precision Components held exclusive manufacturing rights to the patented assembly for the duration of the patent term, that the licensing fee was structured as a percentage of unit cost rather than a flat fee, precisely so that it would scale appropriately, rather than appear as a fixed markup on a spreadsheet. And this was the clause that mattered most, that any attempt by Halverson to manufacture, source, or commission an equivalent component using the patented mechanism through any other party during the active patent term would constitute a material breach, entitling me to injunctive relief and damages. In other words, there was no alternative sourcing plan. Not a legal one. Any machine shop that attempted to replicate the valve assembly's specific internal geometry would be manufacturing a part that infringed directly on a patent I had held, cleanly and uncontested, for 11 years. Halverson's own engineers had built their downstream actuator systems around the specific tolerances and behavior of my patented design. There was no version of finding an alternative supplier that didn't either license my patent through me or commit patent infringement on a product line that, Russ told me, accounted for roughly 22% of Halverson's annual revenue. I told Russ all of this. I could hear him exhale slowly on the other end of the line. She's going to find this out the hard way, isn't she? He said. I'm not trying to make this difficult for anyone, I said. I've been a reliable partner to Halverson for 6 years. I have no interest in punishing the company for one board member's mistake, but I'm also not going to renegotiate a fair contract because someone looked at a spreadsheet without reading the agreement underneath it. 3 weeks passed. I continued manufacturing and delivering the scheduled batch of valve assemblies on the normal schedule because the contract was still active and I had no reason to interrupt service over a disagreement that hadn't yet become a formal action. I did, however, ask my attorney to review the full contract file and confirm in writing exactly what our position would be if Halverson attempted to terminate or source an alternative without proper notice and negotiation. I wanted to be precise, not aggressive. There is a difference, and I have learned over many years that precision serves you better than anger in situations like this. The follow-up came in the form of a letter from Halverson's legal department, not from Vanessa Cole directly, informing me that the company intended to explore alternative sourcing arrangements for the component in question, and requesting a meeting to discuss transition terms. I responded, through my own attorney, with a letter that did three things. First, it reminded Halverson's legal team of the specific exclusivity and breach provisions in the existing contract. Second, it noted, factually and without editorializing, that any third-party manufacturing of an equivalent component during the active patent term would constitute infringement, for which I would pursue full legal remedy. Third, it offered, in good faith, to meet and discuss a renewed agreement on updated terms if Halverson genuinely believed the existing pricing structure needed revisiting, but through proper negotiation, not unilateral termination. I am told, again secondhand, this time from two separate sources inside Halverson, that this letter landed on the desks of people considerably more senior than Vanessa Cole within about 6 hours of being received, and that the conversation that followed was not a comfortable one for her. The meeting that resulted 3 days later included Halverson's CEO, their general counsel, Russ, and, at my request, my own attorney. Vanessa Cole was also present, though I was told she said considerably less than she had in the original boardroom discussion. I did not attend in person. I had no particular need to. My attorney represented my position clearly. I was not interested in punishing Halverson. I valued the relationship, and I was open to a fair renegotiation of pricing if the company could demonstrate genuine cost pressures. But I was not willing to have an exclusive, patent-protected licensing agreement treated as a disposable vendor contract by someone who had not read it before recommending its termination. The result, after that meeting, was a renewed 5-year agreement with modestly adjusted terms that reflected some legitimate volume efficiencies on my end, alongside a reaffirmation of the exclusivity and licensing structure that had existed from the beginning. Nothing dramatic. No public reckoning, no headline-worthy collapse. Just a correction, quiet and procedural, of a mistake that had been made by someone who mistook a balance sheet line item for the entire shape of a relationship she had not bothered to understand. I learned some months later through Russ that Vanessa Cole had remained at Halverson, but in a considerably narrower role than the one she'd arrived with. Her broader cost-cutting mandate having lost most of its institutional support after the valve assembly situation became, internally, something of a cautionary tale. I take no particular satisfaction in that. I did not seek her diminishment. I sought, simply, to have an agreement honored according to its actual terms, and to be regarded, by the people I do business with, as something more specific and more accurate than just a machinist who got lucky. I think often about that phrase in the months since. Just a machinist. I understand where it comes from. I understand that to someone who has spent her career around spreadsheets and board decks, the word machinist can sound like a job title with a ceiling on it. Skilled labor, valuable in its way, but fundamentally interchangeable. Fundamentally beneath the level of strategic conversation happening in the room. What that framing misses every time is that precision work and inventive work are not separate categories. The patent that protects Halverson's 22% of annual revenue did not emerge from a boardroom. It emerged from thousands of hours at a machine, noticing a failure pattern that other people had stopped noticing because they'd stopped looking closely enough to see it. The hands that solve a problem at the tolerance of 2/10,000ths of an inch are not separate from the mind that conceives the solution in the first place. They are the same hands. They were always the same hands. I went back to my shop the Monday after the renewed contract was signed, put on my safety glasses, and ran the scheduled batch the way I always do, checking tolerances, logging the results, signing off on quality control the way I have done 11,000 times before. Nothing about my actual work changed. That was, in its way, the point. I was never the one who needed to learn something from this. I already knew exactly what I was worth. I had simply been waiting, with the specific patience of a man who reads contracts carefully, for someone else to find out. If you've ever been reduced to a job title by someone who never bothered to learn what that title actually contains, leave a comment below. I read every one. And if you know someone who does precise, demanding, underestimated work, tell them their hands and their mind are not two different things. They never were. See you in the next one.